Hello, and welcome to this session on Network Policies Advanced. So what we'd like to do now is, in the previous session, what we were looking at was just network policies and how to create network policies using ingress, egress, plus labels-based policies. So what we'd like to actually do is, we'd like to look at more advanced topics on network policies. So we know that as part of our CKA exam for the Certified Kubernetes Administrator exam, if we look at the curriculum here, you will basically sort of see that there is actually network policies um, included. So it's kind of one of those items that you really have to, understand and make sure that you actually do understand how network policies work and how they work together. So as part of this, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at, some of the documentation here, which is critically important. So, when you're taking the exam, it's really important that you actually understand where you can actually find information about, network policies. You won't have time in the exam to actually read through the actual documentation. So please make sure that you actually read the documentation a few times before on all of the different subjects. You understand them, but you will basically be able to have the documentation open as an open book type exam. So you can, take sections from the actual code themselves, but, just make sure that you actually understand all of the actual sections, regarding like the pod selectors, the actual spec, the pod selector, the policy types, the ingress, egress, and just make sure that you look through all of these examples here. You work your way down through um, how they all fit together, what they mean. You know, Again, in the exam, you probably won't get um, a network policy that will be overly complicated because you wouldn't actually have time to kind of implement such a kind of a network policy that would be involved in, say, production traffic. But the point is that you're expected to be able to prove that you understand how network policies work, um, what the various components of a network policy is, and how they fit into the Kubernetes infrastructure. So I've put down here, if we go back into um, our GitHub repository here, you can see I've put down a 2.2.2 network policies advanced here. And what I've done here is I've put some good kind of information that I've been reading up on personally myself, regarding network policies, trying to understand, even if you kind of take, you know, something like kind of Calco, how Calco actually implements network policies. You may have something different between Calico and something else like kind of Funnel or something. But how they kind of fit together. Read through the kind of setup here. Understand the basic commands of how you would actually do the network policies, and really, this was something that you can sort of see here in question 4, where I sort of said like, okay, so trying different scenarios from pod to pod communications, and I'm trying to put the reference here to the documents that where I actually find this information, because as part of the exam, the open book type scenarios where you can actually go to the exam and you can find the basic information about a particular topic. But the point of the exam is that you've actually gone out, further on your own before the exam. You're not allowed, internet access during the exam, but you've gone out further before the exam, and you've tried to kind of research yourself a little bit about, how, for example, in this case, network policies may do it, in different types of scenarios. So here's a scenario here, from this GitHub repository that I took down, and you can sort of see that, there's a certain image that's been used here, and it's listening on a certain port here for SOCAT, and you can set up your actual service here to provide outbound activity um, to that service, and you can sort of see there's an also a deployment here for Nginx, and in Nginx you're actually installing some components into that container when it actually gets started up. Plus you're exposing a service then, and then really what you're kind of doing here is, you've got a command here that's basically watching your whole cluster, which it is a really valuable um, piece of information here. You may not be able to remember that for the exam of how you would actually watch your full cluster, but if you were setting this up in a production type environment, it would certainly help you understand what's basically being kind of implemented. And again, I mean, it just kind of comes down to with this scenario, it's the same type of idea that we had in the last scenario, where you're checking your inbound and outbound connectivity from your tasks, um, and from your pods. And really, you're reading more information about your egress and your ingress, and you're getting to know and understand those terms. Um, but you can sort of see here, it's also sort of saying, there's actually DNS, because you want to allow the DNS service here. So, you're sort of saying you can actually kind of have DNS support here, which is port 53, so that you could look up your service name here that's provided here um, on a specific port. And again, you're kind of checking to sort of see if these fail or work here. Um, but you're working down through this type of scenario again, and it's a little bit more advanced, especially when you get something like this, and this is where your network policies kind of come in, of understanding, this type of scenario where you've basically got, your IP blocks on your side there, and your accepts and your namespace selectors. Um, Again, for the exam, you just really have to kind of understand all of these before you actually sit down in front of the exam. Will you be asked about any of this, this kind of more advanced setup of a network policy? Maybe, maybe not, but you have to know in the documentation of where you would find it if you were asked. It's critically important that you can find the documentation quite quickly. Um, but you can sort of see here, in this scenario, it's a little bit more advanced, um, but it's kind of working through the same principles. It's just a kind of another step on from what we did in the last actual samples, where we had the more basic kind of network policies. And then you can sort of see question 5 here. Again, I'm kind of putting a reference here. Um, so where I'm kind of following the examples myself. So I'm really kind of trying to look at, where I'm getting it, the ingress definition file from. So, I would not be able to probably remember the actual format of this in the exam. So I'm looking at the documentation here to make sure that, I would know where I can actually find this type of information when I need it quickly and to hand. Um, and in this type of, scenario where we sort of say, we're really getting into learning about setting up test pods, like you create a pod that can prove my theory is actually working, because we don't know in the exam if you would actually have a pod provided for you, or you're expected to create your own pod. But really, learning the basics of actually creating a pod with a label, with an image, and how to run it in interactive mode is certainly going to be critical, because you will be able to use this type of setup and this type of pod, a temporary pod, in different scenarios. So it's not going to just be for network policies, but you may find it useful in different scenarios. So learn off by heart as much as possible these types of commands here. You can sort of see here that the basic here is general, where you're kind of you're checking timeouts and you're checking your DNS entries here, but you know understand how this is kind of being made up here. Kind of going back to your network policies here. So you're working through your kind of notes here. You're keeping an eye on your network policy. You're looking at your behaviors here, um, your allow all, your default, because they may also sort of say in the exam, um, create us a default egress um, type of network policy. So you can sort of see here it says you can create a default egress isolation policy for a namespace, okay, by creating a network policy that selects all pods but does not allow any egress traffic to those pods. So they may kind of ask something like that, and it's really not to kind of um, scare anybody here to sort of say you will have to kind of be reading through all of these type of documentation during the exam. But I mean, you know, try to understand. If I went to kind of documentation here, and the first thing that if I had a question about network policy, I would probably sort of say, netpol, because that's the short hand version of it. Um, but I could sort of see down here, I could sort of see, well, there's also declare network policy here. So is this the one I really kind of need? I can look at here and I can sort of say, well, here this looks very similar to what I was basically doing in my um, video before, and then I was creating a deployment, and then I was exposing the service, and then I was getting my pods, and then I can actually test my pod, by accessing it from another pod, and you're sort of seeing that the actual commands um, here are the a lot of the times actually already defined in some place. And again, it's just really about trying to find out where they really are, because once you get into search results and you go to kind of your network policies here, you can sort of see that there's documentation here that's for production, or a real live um, cluster, if you're working with a real life cluster. So, I mean, again, Kubernetes provides fantastic documentation here about how you kind of fit all of this kind of together. But again, it's your responsibility to read this documentation, understand it, try and map it out, like we sort of said before. Make sure that you actually understand, what happens when I do a default ingress, or what happens when I do a default egress, you know, and test it out in your scenario. I love this kind of idea that I can set up like a Kubernetes engine cluster quite quickly, and I can make sure that I can kind of test some scenarios out here, and I can sort of see this one works for me, this one doesn't work for me, um, and it really gets me kind of familiar with how this all kind of fits together, because in the exam again, it's about kind of getting really kind of defined, and making sure that you can find the information quickly in the documentation itself, and second of all, you can adjust it to the cluster that you're going to be presented with. So um, it just kind of really kind of helps you then. And then if you're kind of really kind of taking it on past the exam, and you're looking at kind of Weave and Calico and Funnel and those types of networking solutions for your pods, really then it kind of comes into where you can sort of say, I can set up specific networking policies for specific type of providers. So um, again, the documentation for Calico and Weave and Fanon and those types of networking providers would basically have very, very good information about how you would actually set up specific network policies um, for that provider itself. But again, this is just extra information here. I probably would not be kind of studying this, for the exam itself. It's just to sort of say that this is actually available. If you did want to kind of read through it and just kind of educate yourself a little bit on that, then we kind of have some more extra information here on network policies. Trying to figure out about DNS, um, DNS entries and DNS names, and trying to sort of saying, here's a fully qualified DNS name, and the service is this and the service is that, and trying to sort of make sure that you at least understand how that kind of works together. and again, it's really kind of based on the previous examples that we basically saw as well. But there's some fundamental differences, and it's all just about um, setting down, you know, yourself to say, I need to first of all know about the basics of network policies, and then I'm going to know a little bit more about the actual advanced. And it depends on if you do use them during the, your daily job. Um, you would be very familiar with a lot of this already. But if you're not, it just takes a little bit more studying. So I wouldn't be um, I wouldn't be letting yourself get kind of, too far ahead of yourself for the exam. I mean, it's about, if you're asked about a network policy, it's really about kind of inputs and outputs, right? So, I mean, you won't be asked to kind of, say for example, create your own cluster, and predefine all of the network policies, um, using some specific provider. So that's the way I'm kind of approaching this. I'm learning here to understand much more about network policies, and then I'm going to define and so say, okay, so I know about the basics, I know a little bit more about the advanced, and I'm hoping that's enough that would sort of say if a question came up on the network policies itself, I would be able to understand, find the information, um, and pass that question quite quickly. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is just pass the actual exam. And then for work wise, that's a different scenario again, but really trying to pass the exam is the number one objective. So I hope this helps somebody, and I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.